Carrie Thompson.
You're both with the Meadow Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University.
And this is Fahrenheit 140.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to our second podcast. It was actually supposed to be podcast number 3. We did record a podcast, I guess it's 1.5, about the new IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. But after 3 attempts, we just weren't happy with it.
We got pretty dark, y'all. So we decided to spare you our processing of that difficult news that came out in August.
Yeah, there was a lot of bad news in it, but there was also good news. I would say good news on the side of the science getting better.
Yeah.
Our ability to understand what's happening getting better, and there is a discussion of some ways that humanity can try and mitigate some of these impacts. And being someone who always sees the glass as 1/4 full, there's opportunity there really for all of us to tackle the problem of climate change, and specifically water resources.
Yeah, and they framed that report as a tool for policymakers, and so they really did try to make it actionable, which is something you don't see a lot in scientific reports. So there is a lot to celebrate, and it took us a month to get there, but it did have some good medicine.
But we still don't want to release that.
But yeah, we don't want to.
Yeah. So
stay tuned. We'll put it out as a bonus track at some point.
So for this show, we've got our standard, if I can use the word standard, since it's our second show. But start off with what is it that we saw that was interesting that happened since the last episode. We have a special guest, John Nielsen-Gammon, to talk about a study that he did for Texas 2036, looking at extreme climate events in Texas. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Nielsen-Gammon, he's the state climatologist with Texas A&M University. And I don't know if there's a whole lot of good news there, but to me, information and understanding is positive. And then we'll end with our a couple bright spots, and
including a poem.
Yeah. So got to if you can stomach the state climatologist, you can get a poem at the end. So we'll start off with interesting things that we have seen out in the big wide world about climate. And Carrie, you want to start us off?
Sure, Robert. Thanks. Well, kind of along the lines of the IPCC report, my favorite finding, if you want to call it that, was an emphasis on the role of methane. We all hear about carbon dioxide and how we really need to look at our carbon footprint, but the truth is that carbon is a slow corrector. So we do need to focus on our carbon footprints, and we need to think about carbon reductions, but methane is kind of where it's at for quick bang for buck. And this was the first time the IPCC really highlighted the role of methane. And even though we've only been doing this a few months, Robert and I have both been pretty surprised at how often Texas comes up in the national and international conversation. And so goes it with methane. So my first article is actually an editorial, but it kind of highlights some things that are happening I thought were of interest, and this is out of the Houston Chronicle. The title is "Carbon Gets the Headlines, but Texas's methane emissions are the root cause of climate change." And it highlights that, and I think we talked about this in the first episode, the Permian Basin, which is largely in Texas, is kind of a huge player, both in impact but potentially in solutions as well. And this article highlights that it's the highest methane emitting basin in the nation. And because we here in Texas lead the country in production of natural gas, and we hold nearly 1/4 of the nation's gas reserves in this basin. Texas is going to be a key player and a key location, kind of battlefield in these discussions about what needs to be done to address climate change. So, just goes on to explain that what happens, not that natural gas itself or methane itself is problematic necessarily, but there's a tendency for the well fields and the operations to kind of do a poor job at keeping those gases from leaking off. And in fact, it's a practice to burn off excess gas. And so there's a lot of waste that goes on in the production of natural gas. And so I think this article references it and some other things we've talked about. It's not only a waste of the resource and a harmful pollutant, but it's costly. And there's a lot of money to be gained by addressing those leaks and trying to be less wasteful. So just highlights that there's a real opportunity there in the Permian Basin, not just to make a little impact, but to make an international impact. And the article also references that the EPA has been ordered by Biden to issue some new rules about methane production, and that should be coming out in the next weeks. So by the time we meet again here on the podcast, we should have an update on that front.
I did see an article that the price of natural gas is so high now that companies are starting to capture some of that gas in the Permian Basin because they can actually make money on it, and natural gas is particularly high in Europe. I think
they're having a crisis right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're anticipating winter heating costs 4 to 5 times normal because of the increase in the cost of natural gas over there. So liquefied gas is looks like it could be a moneymaker, I guess, for American oil and gas companies.
Well, and that's it. The article kind of ends too by saying a lot of the companies, the oil and gas companies, are driving the call for regulation too because they want some regulatory certainty, and at the end of the day, they're losing money by letting this practice continue. The wasteful practices continue. So,
well, cool. Well, one way of decreasing greenhouse gases is to prevent them from escaping in the first place. Another way is to capture them out of the atmosphere and get rid of them, fix them some way, shape, or form. And according to an article by Quartz, the world's biggest carbon sucking machine is switching on in Iceland. Actually, it has switched on. It's been live now for several weeks. And they're doing something that's called DAC or DAC, direct air capture. And it's operated by a company called Climeworks. And they named the plant Orca. I didn't find out why they named it Orca. I guess it's like the killer whale of CO2 or something, where they're filtering out CO2, mixing it with water, and then pumping it into deep wells. And where over the course of a few years and interacting with the basalt, turns it into stone, which is a permanent or a more permanent removal of CO2 from the atmosphere.
What do they say what they do with the stone?
Well, it's just in situ, so it's basically it forms down there in the basalts.
Oh, okay. They leave it.
So, and there's a number of being a hydrogeologist, a number of questions come to mind. It's like, well, if it's forming in the stone, probably some kind of limestone, that must be clogging up the subsurface to a certain degree. So, the effectiveness decreases over time. So I'd have to drill another or additional injection wells. But they've been getting quite a bit of support to do this. The Swiss insurance company has bought the carbon credits, and apparently Coca-Cola and Microsoft are also clients to ClimateWorks for future projects. It's worth kind of going out and checking out what it looks like, because when I first saw the pictures of it, I thought it was like an amp on a guitar, like a guitar amp. It looked like something Metallica would own. I
I
thought it
was
looks
kind of
like.
waiting for like when this is going to go to. You need to go to Iceland to check it out. That's
Well, I do plan on going to Iceland to check it out. So it is. It would be a cool thing. I can't tell exactly. I need to do a little more research, find out exactly where it's at. This plant is going to remove about 4,000 metric tons per year of carbon dioxide. In comparison, there's about 31 billion metric tons of CO2 that was released last year. And last year was actually a low year because of the pandemic. Just a quick side note is there are other private companies looking at direct air capture, and a company called Carbon Engineering is building bigger plants capable of doing 1 million metric tons per year. And one of the sites that they're supposed to be working on is out in the Permian Basin.
mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that someplace in Texas. Permian Basin does also go into New Mexico, and I couldn't find an
Yeah.
exact location looking at their website. But expectation is that more and more of these will go in. I think detractors would be like 4,000 metric tons or even 1 million metric tons compared to 31 billion. But you have to start somewhere
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
learn the lessons and then carry those lessons forward, which is typical path of technology.
All right, my next one. I'll tee it up, Robert, with a question to you
Uh-oh.
because um, it's actually I'll tell you what it's called too, but it's from the Washington Post, and it was within this last month. It's called "Why It's a Mistake to Teach Climate Change Only in Science Class." And I thought maybe I would just use that as a segue to see if you want to highlight some of the things we're trying to do on the education front here in Texas.
Sure. And that's a great title. I haven't read the article. I'm looking forward to hearing your summary of it, but I already like it because climate change affects everybody, just not science students. And so it's important for really everybody to understand these issues. And at the Meadow Center, we are working and developing a curriculum for school children on climate change. But we're also working on our website currently to provide information to anybody, including adults, to understand the basics of climate change, as well as understand kind of what the impacts are, as well as what people can do. So thank you
Awesome.
for teeing that up.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, it's pretty cool. So this article talks about the Washington Post did a poll, which I love. I always love hearing the outcomes of these polls, but they did a poll on the attitudes of teenagers on various subjects, and um, one of the questions was what they see as the biggest threat to their generation. And only 49% of them said that climate change was a major threat, which is pretty shocking. And the article kind of goes on to say a lot of what Robert just said, which is that climate change is really interwoven into so many other issues that we're facing right now. It's kind of inseparable, but also it's not something that's just relegated to the realm of science. So we'll get more to that. But I thought maybe we could play Family Feud and see. You want to guess what they think is a bigger threat to their generation? Any guesses?
Um, um, China taking down TikTok.
Oh yeah, they probably can't even fathom that. So that would terrify them, I'm sure. Well, it was interesting. The top threat they identified was the political division in our country, which I thought was pretty savvy and also very
Yeah.
much linked to climate change and climate change policy, right?
True. True.
They have the cost of healthcare, racial discrimination, gun violence, terrorism, and then climate change. So
Change.
that's kind of the ranking. The article goes on to talk, though, about the importance of teaching climate as a policy issue and as a historical issue in the context of history and policy, and not just the science, the nuts and bolts of, of weather patterns and the chemical inputs to the atmosphere.
Yep, I would completely agree with that. Um, and even science students need to know about the policy and also science role in policy, which of course is one of my favorite topics.
Yeah.
But we won't go down that
I'll
down
just
that
read
path.
this little quote here, and it says, climate change is also a social, political, economic issue. It brings fresh urgency to reimagining how we teach young people to participate in civic life. I thought that was great. Growing awareness of the threats of inequality, racial injustice, and misinformation have generated long overdue calls for a new approach to civics and history education. But even those proposals ignore a crucial fact: we can't have a flourishing society without a healthy planet. So I thought it made some really nice points. And we'll include all the links to these articles in our website.
Awesome. So another article that I found is it's titled "Researchers Potty-Trained Young Cows: A
Oh
Promising
my
Measure to
Lord.
Reduce Greenhouse Gases," published by none other than the Smithsonian Magazine.
Nice.
I was telling Carrie earlier that I don't go out seeking poop articles; they just seem to find me. Um, um, it's also interesting to me. I'm also very interested, besides poop, in I guess diet and food and stuff. And I know there's a lot of chatter out there about cows and cattle and plant-based foods and things like that. And so there is a great deal of research happening out there to come up with greener um, animal products. This study was done by the University of Auckland in New Zealand and learned lots of interesting things. One is that one cow tends to pee up to 8 gallons a day.
Goodness.
That's a lot of pee. And you might be thinking, what does pee have to do with climate change?
Oh
Well,
Lord, this
urine,
topic.
what? Urine contains nitrogen, which turns into ammonium when it's mixed with the poop. And then as that seeps, into the ground, the bacteria convert ammonium to nitrous oxide, which in the United States is about 7% of all greenhouse gases. Another interesting thing was that the idea for this study came as one of the authors was interviewed by a radio announcer on the radio. And the radio announcer joked that, man, if only you could teach cows to use the loo. And so they invented the moo loo. No joke. That's what they call it. And tried to change young calves to use the moo loo. And they were surprised that it actually was much easier than they thought. Kind of what they did was if a calf, and part of it was like watching, when a calf looked like it needed to pee, they would then push it into the mooloo. It would pee and then it would get a treat, something with molasses or crushed barley. And then pretty quickly, most of the calves, not all, because there's always one, learned real quickly that, yeah, if you go in there and pee, then you get a treat. And so um, they were able to get a peer-reviewed paper out of this research.
Wow.
And of course, the question is can you get ranchers or cow people to train their cows to use a mooloo?
Well, I've read some other things this month because we talked about cows last episode also, um, and all the cool food products that are coming out to feed the cattle to reduce their
Yeah,
emissions, right?
right,
Because
right.
that IPCC report put meat production at about 15%, um, carrying about 15% of the blame for yearly greenhouse gas emissions, which is pretty high. You think
Hmm.
about it. So anyway, I've seen some articles this month, just headlines about beef becoming a luxury item like champagne, or and that different countries are going to be reducing their livestock head counts, and it's going to be it is a major factor. It's one of the few factors where we have some control, and so people are looking at what can you do to make that habit of ours a little less harmful.
And I grew up in the country in northwestern Illinois, and still friends with high school buddies that are farmers up there, and of course, no ranchers here in Texas, and for the most part, that subculture kind of looks down their nose at these issues, and I'll see the memes and all this stuff, but I'm like, the people that you need to see those memes aren't seeing the memes, or they're not
Yeah.
buying it, and it's
Yeah.
and it's like the you need to change because the world's changing. The younger generation is more concerned about these things. So it does seem strategically, it seems like looking at some of these things to make beef production or whatever it is greener, and more climate friendly would just be a good marketing thing.
Yeah, well, all these articles so far have been about the promise of technology too, right?
Mhm.
And so it's one thing to say like, okay, cattle are having this impact, but what's cool is that people are responding to that and saying, all right, let's think about where they go to the bathroom and what we're feeding them, and different techniques that can minimize those impacts and still keep you know those practices going that are part of our culture. So I don't have any other articles pulled except for my good news report.
Okay.
So
Well, same here. So we'll save our good news till the very end, so we end on a high note.
but our best news is that we have a guest,
Yes.
a very high prestige guest.
And John Nielsen-Gammon. So coming up next. Well, hello, everybody. We're excited to have with us today Dr. John Nielsen-Gammon. He is the Texas State Climatologist, the director of the Texas Center for Climate Studies, as well as a Regents Professor at the Texas A&M University Department of Atmospheric Sciences. Is that correct, John?
Yep, that's right. I'm also, by the way, the director of the Southern Regional Climate Center. That does climate services for basically 6 states in the southern region of southern United States on behalf of basically National Weather Service and NOAA in general.
Okay, wonderful. And are you still the person who works on the was it the climate maps that come out every month for the state or every week for the state?
Yeah, we help out with the drought monitor.
Drought monitor, that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, we basically compile information from around the state and get input from folks and try to make sure that things are both accurate in terms of the depiction of drought in the state of Texas and consistent from region to region within the state. So sort of make everything consistent. And unfortunately, people tend to hate me in the drought monitor community because we get down to the sub-county scale, and so sometimes it takes hours to figure out all the changes in Texas, and doesn't leave much time for other parts of the United States.
Well, we certainly appreciate your work on that. And in my career in Texas, and particularly my previous position at Texas Water Development Board, going into the what turned out to be the second worst drought of record for the state, at least, it was really developed a lot of admiration for you, just in terms of communicating atmospheric science to the public and to the legislature. So fully confess I have a little bit of a man crush on you, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say that to an Aggie, but Carrie's nodding her head as an Aggie. Can I say that, Carrie? No, I can't say that.
Generally not preferred, but
not preferred. Okay. All
right. I know.
Well,
we allow it in certain circumstances.
Well, we're very pleased to have John with us because he has, was it last week or the week before, a new report that came out called The Assessment of Historic and Future Trends of Extreme Weather in Texas, 1900 to 2036, some work that he did for an organization called Texas 2036. And John, why don't you start off by just giving us a broad overview of what this report's about and why you did it?
Yeah, sure. Well, this is it's an update of a report that we did a year or two ago, so that we could include, the rather extreme winter conditions that happened in February, as well as what other up-to-date data is available. And the purpose is essentially, at least from the point of view of the funding agency, to help Texas make good long-range planning decisions as we move toward and past the Texas bicentennial. Of course, my objective fits with the mission of the Office of the State Climatologist in general, which is to help the state of Texas make the best possible use of weather and climate information. And people can't adapt and plan for climate trends unless they know what they are. So we try to basically give the broad brush overview of what's happening in the various facets of extreme weather and how climate's affecting them.
So you mentioned one of the drivers for updating the report was the cold snap that we all suffered through earlier this year, and if I remember correctly, at the time it was a little unclear if there was a climate change component to that, although maybe it appeared that there was. Has there been some attribution science done since then to maybe quantify? Was that just a natural thing that happens every once in a while, like Little House on the Prairie when they had that terrible snowstorm, or is there a climate component to that as well, climate change component?
There hasn't been a formal attribution study by which they looked at the event and figured out how much of it was natural variability, how much was climate change, or at least more correctly, how the odds of such an event might have changed. There is, though, a lot of confusion over that issue. I was a contributor to a paper about that event and its consequences, and another climate scientist was a contributor too, and this other person wrote a first draft of a chapter, and then I read it and it's like, I disagree with just about everything in this chapter. So it's not surprising the public's confused, because I'm confused too. So the most recent paper that came out on it basically said that Arctic sea ice is causing the stratospheric circulation to become stretched more frequently, and that leads to a greater frequency of weather patterns that bring cold air down to Texas. And it's easy to get from that, climate change is making cold events worse. But just to make sure, I corresponded with the author, and he agreed that the proper interpretation was that climate change is making this sort of weather pattern more common. But when it does happen, the air that's being brought down from the Arctic is warmer than it used to be, because the Arctic is warming faster than every place else. So the net effect is actually, we're getting less extreme cold temperatures than we used to. So it's a matter of competing effects, and one effect favors more cold, but the stronger effect favors less cold.
Interesting. So one of your conclusions is, I think anybody that's been in Texas for a while, and I've been here, it's 30 years now this year, that seems like it's getting warmer around here, and we have more 100-degree days. Is that something, does the data show that?
It certainly does. I mean, when I first saw some projections that said we'll see an average of like 70, 100-degree days by mid-century, I was thinking, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. There must be something wrong with how that calculation's been done or something. But since we started looking at it closely, I can see how that happens. I mean, we've had basically a doubling of the number of 100-degree days since the late 1970s, and that trend is expected to continue in all regions of the state of Texas. And that's with just 2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming so far. And we'll probably have another 1.5 degrees of warming by 2036 compared to, say, the past 30-year average. So yeah, things will probably come close to another doubling on average. We'll have many years that are more frequent. It's very rare to have a year without 100-degree days. That used to be a bit more common in the past. And the reason that's going to happen is because temperatures are in the upper 90s most days in the summer. So a few degrees of warming gets you over that threshold, which is numerically significant, but also you can really feel the difference here. It's not like it's just a little bit warmer. It becomes really uncomfortable.
John, can you explain? I appreciate you going into the details. What I think a lot of folks, when they see or hear that it's going to get a 1 degree hotter or 1.5 degrees hotter, people think, oh, it's going to be 90 instead of 89 degrees. Can you explain how 1.5 degree change results in doubling or tripling of 100-degree days? Like, how do we hear that 1 degree change and make it make sense to folks?
Okay, yeah. So imagine, let's see. So College Station, Texas, the normal high temperature in August is about 96 or 97. So in August, you typically have probably about 25 days that get above 95. But you only have maybe 10 days that get above 98 and maybe 5 days that get above 100. So as temperatures go up, basically those categories start shifting. And so the 10 days per month becomes 100 degrees, warm up another 3 degrees, and the 25 days per month is a 100-degree threshold.
So it's a daily average, or when you hear that 1 degree change, how does that translate? What is that? Because that means sea levels are rising. It has all sorts of implications system-wide. Just trying to make that make a little more sense.
Yeah, we use temperature change because that's sort of what's directly driving all the other stuff. Increased greenhouse gases means the atmosphere can't cool as easily to lose energy to space, and so temperatures go up until it's able to lose the amount of heat it needs to. And you have to do that affects temperatures. It affects things directly because temperatures are warmer. Then it affects weather patterns as well because of all the interconnections in the climate system. So if we start with, say, 1 degree global warming, first off, the expected warming rate over land is higher than that because most of the globe's ocean. Ocean takes a long time to warm up. It warms slowly. So we get a bit 25% more warming over Texas than we do globally. Then on top of that, when we talk about global temperatures, we're talking Celsius. But in Texas, we live in Fahrenheit, so that's another doubling basically of the numbers. So just globe's gone up 1 degree. That means Texas has gone up 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and still rising like that. That'll directly affect the cold extremes and the hot extremes. It affects the amount of moisture in the air because the warmer air can hold more water. So that then affects the amount of extreme rainfall we get because when it's raining harder. And it affects things that bring us rainfall, like hurricanes, because those are driven by moisture and heat and the whole bit. It affects global circulation patterns. It's the whole system is interconnected. And until 20 or 30 years ago, it was easy to imagine, hey, that's the natural system, and we're living in the natural system, but we don't affect it very much. No, unfortunately, we've demonstrated that we can cause the climate to change more rapidly than just about any natural process we know of.
So we know, the data shows temperatures are increasing That's unequivocal. I'm pretty sure that's the word that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses, and we're expecting those to increase in the future. Overall, I think globally, it's expected to be more precipitation, but Texas, it looks like my understanding is we really don't see a change in precipitation in totals.
Well, we have seen a change. Precip's gone up about 10 to 15% over the past century in eastern Texas, but it's not clear that's part of the long-term global trend. So we don't know whether that's going to continue. But the weird thing about precipitation is, if you think about, there's not a lot of water in the air at any given time. Certainly not compared to the land surface, not compared to the oceans and so forth. So you can't increase rainfall overall without increasing the rate of evaporation overall. Those things are tied together. So large portions of the earth are actually going to end up getting drier, almost as many places as get wetter, because there's a limitation on how much rain you can actually produce in the climate system. Farther north in Canada, it's going to be wetter. Almost all climate models agree on that. Farther south in Mexico, probably drier, according to most climate models. Texas, we're sort of in between. So rainfall might go up, it might go down. It's actually one of the less certain aspects of our future climate.
I guess when we talk about water resources, it's obviously rainfall is important here locally, but the temperature can take a lot more than what's being given by precipitation. Isn't that right? I mean, you could have an increase in rainfall, but still have less runoff into a river system.
Yeah, I mean the drought is having less water than you normally do or that a system needs. And rainfall is part of that. That's how much water is going in. But evaporation is taking it out as well. And if you have higher temperatures, that tends to mean more evaporation. So water doesn't stay in lakes as long or reservoirs as long. It evaporates from soils more rapidly. It doesn't hang around as long for plants to be able to utilize. And so that's the sort of the other side of the coin. We're not going to, higher temperatures isn't really going to cause droughts, but it's going to make droughts more severe when the rainfall drops in those particular years or even decades when we go through dry periods.
So I think you mentioned a little bit ago about that. We are expecting to see an increase in rainfall intensity, and so we're going to see more rainfall falling over shorter periods of time, which is going to cause an increase in flooding. Did y'all look at that in this report?
Yeah, we've seen trends in urban flooding, especially in Houston, which shouldn't surprise people in Houston about that. There haven't been any observed trends in river flooding, and part of that is presumably that we've got more reservoirs now for flood control than we used to.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of that's a lesson for flooding. We have some control over flooding locally. We can't really affect the rainfall ourselves very much here in Texas, but we can affect what happens to it between the rain falling and homes and cars being washed away. We have some control over what happens during that process. You're right. We'll have more intense rainfall. We've seen more intense rainfall over time. That means there's more longer periods without much rainfall in between those, and that's going to affect how much water is able to soak into the soil when it does rain. If you think about it, if you got moist soil, get a couple inches of rain, most of that water is going to run off. But if you have dry soil, most of it's going to soak into the ground as long as it's not raining too hard. So flood intensity for the lighter storms would probably actually decrease because more of that water soaks in. Of course, you get something like Harvey with 30, 40, 50 inches of rain. Another 1 or 2 inches of rain soaking into the soil is not going to matter. Mm-hmm. And then in the city, most of the ground is paved over, so you don't even have that helping you. So we expect urban flooding to increase more than flooding along rivers or in rural areas because warmer temperatures doesn't help you in the city.
And I'm going to contradict myself because when I asked that question, I made it sound like I hadn't read the report, but I have. And you, and in fact, you quantify it that there could be 30 to 50% more urban flooding due to extreme rainfall events.
Yeah, specifically an increase of 30 to 50% in the frequency.
Is that by 2036?
Yeah, compared to the last half of the 20th century.
That's remarkable because 2036 is what, 15 years away. It's not that's not that far away. We've certainly seen, like here in Austin, they're revising, or maybe they finished revising the flood maps, and it had been a while since they updated the rainfall statistics, but the 500-year floodplains are becoming the 100-year floodplain. So the floodplains have gotten bigger, broader.
Yeah, I'm a little worried about Austin in that regard, and I don't think you would be able to guess why. So I'll tell you why.
Okay.
So yeah, the latest update of extreme rainfall frequency has a big increase. It's like before we thought that a really heavy one-day rainstorm was 11 inches. Now it's 14 inches according to the numbers, or something like that. But the biggest reason for that increase in the update is with more data, the report's able to get down to finer detail about the geographical effects on rainfall. So the Balcones escarpment, the change in elevation as you go from southeast to northwest across Austin, is a focal point for extreme rainfall. It forces air upward. If it's unstable already, it's just going to keep going. I think most people in Austin thinks the reason for the update is climate change. And that contributed a bit to it, but it's not the main factor there. I think also people in Austin think that they've seen an increase of flooding due to climate change recently, and they've seen a little, but it's not like Houston where it's gone up dramatically. Mm-hmm. There, the increased frequency in the new estimates is driven by changes in the frequency of flooding. So I think, unlike Houston, which is doing the same sort of adjustments because the numbers got updated, Austin thinks they're being updated due to climate change, but the numbers are still based on historical events. They're not even reflecting the present day risk, let alone future risks. So it's worse than we thought, so to speak, in terms of Austin and extreme rainfall. We think we've seen a big increment due to climate change, and probably haven't seen the half of it yet.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 110% on that it's a backward looking thing, and it's just going to get worse with time. Just a clarification on the you were saying that the increase in flooding potential in Austin is not a climate change, not mostly a climate change thing. So what is it? Is it an urbanization thing?
Well, there have been floods in particular locations. So, like Onion Creek watershed, southern Austin has gotten nailed a lot. But if you look north around Georgetown, Round Rock, so forth, there hasn't been much up there. So a few things have made the news, and the other thing that happens, of course, is that as Austin grows dramatically, you've got more people living along more streams, and so there's more opportunities for flooding.
Gotcha. More opportunities for flooding, and more opportunities for flooding to be impacting people.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. kind of moving down to Houston. You say in a report that the projections of hurricanes is that they're expected to stay the same, or there might even be fewer hurricanes in the future. So that seems like that could be good news in a report with very little good news.
Yeah, it's not like all extremes get worse. Things get simplified by that, but you have to look at each one individually. It's also not like hurricanes get better. The total number of hurricanes probably decreases. We're not extremely confident about that, but that's what the models show. There's enough variation from year to year that we can't really tell whether there's a 50-year trend in that sort of thing. But the proportion of storms that are more intense is apparently going up and is likely to continue going up. So fewer storms, yeah, but not necessarily fewer of the ones that really cause a lot of devastation. So that part is kind of small consolation. And then on top of the fact that sea levels are higher already, so that means the risk of storm surge is higher along the coast, even if the hurricane strength wasn't changing. And meanwhile, with the warmer atmosphere, hurricanes are producing more intense rainfall as well, so that doesn't help either. Mm-hmm. If you want more good news about hurricanes, I'll give you one more tidbit. It seems that thanks to some research out of Rice University, storms are going to become less likely to stall over the Texas coast. So that'll help reduce the odds of a future Harvey. But unfortunately, the increase in rainfall intensity is probably going to be stronger than that effect. So we're still stuck.
So I guess I've got one last question, and Carrie, I'm creating space in there for you to jump in, or maybe you just don't want to get in the way of the man crush. It's.
I am a little intimidated by that.
It's all right. We can do a menage a
trois. Just one last thing my last question, I guess, is, and I don't remember if this was in the first report or not, but you talk about wildfires, increased risk for wildfires, and you seem to specifically call out East Texas. Is that just because there's more trees out there, or is there something else going on?
It's sort of more trees, but more fundamentally, if it comes back to our discussion of drought, if the whole system becomes drier as we expect, then it's less supportive of plants and trees and so forth. So the plant communities that we normally see in West Texas move closer to Central Texas and so forth and so on. To drying things out, you might think, well, that means we'll get more fires, but there also has to be something to burn. And some of the research in West Texas says that basically, become more like eastern New Mexico, which is more arid. You don't have this continuous expanses of grasslands necessarily. So you might actually have less fuel going forward. Whereas in East Texas, there's plenty of fuel, and it'll dry out more frequently and more rapidly. So that's why the risk is expected to go up in East Texas, but not necessarily so much in West Texas.
Well, I think one thing that's particularly helpful with this study, and as you know, there's a spectrum of viewpoints on do we really know what's happening, and can we really project into the future with the climate models? How accurate are the climate models? And I think a key contribution of this work is showing that we see in the measured data these trends, and you can project those trends out into the future, but then also those trends are agreeing for the most part with what the climate models are saying. So that's kind of maybe a positive outcome in the sense of helping in part to validate the climate modeling that has occurred, and perhaps that gives us greater certainty or a better feeling about what those projections look like, deeper into the future.
Yeah, from a just from a self-interest as a climate scientist, it's nice that they've got multiple lines of evidence supporting things, so that people are more likely to believe that the trends we see and project are actually real trends. It's beneficial for society, because if all we had was just the data and no physical understanding and no climate models, then we'd see this trend over 40 years and say, well, how do we know it's not going to reverse itself for the next 40 years? So the real insight and the real benefit for being able to plan for the future comes from being able to see that the trends that we've observed are, for the most part, consistent with what we expect to see happening because of why the climate system changing, and they're consistent with what other computer simulations say ought to happen, both in numbers and in the general direction. And we use all those sorts of sources of information in the report to say, yes, this is clearly happening. This is going to continue. That for temperature, for rainfall, we've seen an increase, but it may or may not continue. And it lets us, say more clearly which of these trends are things we definitely need to plan for, and which ones we have to allow for different possibilities on.
Were there any surprises?
I was a bit surprised at how rapidly we were losing relief from summertime temperatures. A graphic produced with the updated report looked at how cold does it get in July and August. Well, cold is relative, of course. How mild do temperatures get? Do we get days in the 60s? Do we get days in the 50s? And the high temperatures actually still haven't really caught up to where they were back in the 1930s when we had the Dust Bowl and all that, before we had lots of irrigation, lots of reservoirs. But the low temperatures have gone up. They've gone up fairly dramatically. And people have said, hey, this was a nice mild summer, because, well, the numbers show that the high temperatures weren't all that high. They were below normal. But if you look at turn around and say, well, how cold did it get? It didn't get cold. We actually didn't get relief from the summer heat over this past summer. We finally started getting some decent cold fronts recently, but I think anybody from up north who came to Texas for the summer would think it was kind of hot down here.
I've heard too the nighttime temperatures have not been going low as they used to, so we don't get that nightly relief. Is that?
Yeah, that's right, and that's partly because the amount of moisture in the air has gone up, and that sort of helps retain the heat. And partly because with the Gulf of Mexico warming, that's feeding both heat and moisture into the air, and really keeps the air warm. Doesn't allow it to cool off much.
So, do you ever get invited to parties with news like this? I mean, I feel like you
drink hurricanes, mix up some hurricanes, and
well, Halloween is coming up, so my ability to scare people could come in handy.
I plan on getting dressed up as you and holding up that report.
Too much information, Robert.
Yeah, it might be a little creepy.
I would love to know a little bit more about the role of state climatologists, and just for folks that, they might be meeting you for the first time, how long have you been holding that crown, and what does that mean to be the state climatologist?
Well, fundamentally, it means I have a piece of paper from Governor George W. Bush that he signed in year 2000 saying that he was appointing me as Texas State Climatologist. The role has never been officially defined in the legislature. To some extent, that's, from my point of view, that's sort of a good thing, because I get to do whatever I want to do, and it helps avoid the science being politicized, because whoever's in charge doesn't get to impose their self-interest on the scope of my activities. But my mission is basically to help the state of Texas make the best possible use of weather and climate information. So that includes, explaining what's going on, analyzing the data, monitoring conditions, helping serve as basically a local interface with the federal government and providing services to the state of Texas, and ultimately making people's life easier and more prosperous. So yeah, not scary at all, really.
Yeah, yeah. Do you get engaged by Texas industry and legislators? And curious, kind of what circles you get drawn into.
Yeah, it's mostly things like agriculture producers, farmers and ranchers. Of course, are very weather and climate sensitive. They want to know what's going to happen in the next few months. Water suppliers, water managers, they want to know what's going to happen in the next 50 to 75 years. And so the relative importance of variability in climate change is different depending on the audience. And then I get talk to industries that are water dependent that don't want to have their supply go out. We've got to talk to bankers or insurance companies that have to carry risk due to changing climate and so forth. So yeah, it's really a quite diverse audience. And groups that care about the natural environment and want to know what's going on with that and how climate's going to affect things. So it's really very diverse audiences.
Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing your expertise. Congratulations on this report, and a big thanks to Texas 2036 for supporting your work on doing this. It's been getting a lot of press. I'd say every day since it's come out, I've seen an article mentioning this, and just as your work has done in the past, this work and your work in the futures is helping to provide information to Texans, just like you said, and helping Texans and policymakers make informed decisions. So look forward to continuing to see you around.
Yeah, and we'll be putting a link to the report on the podcast side, and it's full of surprises to me, and I really appreciate how easy to read it is and how comprehensive it is. And thank you for your work.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Well, that was
all right.
Carrie talking to Dr. Nielsen-Gammon. Now the world knows I have a man crush on him.
Yeah, I get it. I get why. It's very impressive.
Time
for good news, yeah?
Good news.
Yeah, time for the good news.
Let's see. You should go first, and then I can go, and then you can read your poem.
Okay, perfect. So I actually chose a book for my good news, and like we mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, the IPCC report gave us some focus on looking for the good news, and I was really happy to see Jane Fonda actually put out a book since we've been together called "What Can I Do?" And I thought that was just a perfect title for kind of giving some hope to those of us who maybe don't know what we can do because the problem seems so big.
Mm-hmm.
Also, since then, Katherine Hayhoe has put out a book called "Saving Us," and I'll promise to read that one for next time. But
okay.
I thought I would just share with y'all what Jane Fonda says you can do, and maybe you could pick one thing that'll make you feel like you're doing your part. So
cool.
Let's see. I'm going to just kind of scroll through these really quickly. And just a caveat, her politics may not be your politics, but I think there's something in here for everybody. So the first one was just focus on voting for people that are talking about climate change. And the second one was eat less fish. And if you can't eat less fish, eat fish that are lower on the food chain, like anchovies or sardines. So that one's kind of straightforward. That's just to contribute to ocean health and make sure that native fisheries are available for the folks that do rely on those fisheries for subsistence. This one was interesting. Vote women into power. There was a study that said one of the top ways to reduce carbon in the atmosphere was by educating girls and empowering women, and that countries where women lead tend to embrace climate treaties more often than those where men lead. So that was interesting. She says to seek peace in the world. And she points out that the U.S. Pentagon is the biggest institutional user of fossil fuels in the entire world. And, basically says the more we can encourage funding for diplomacy versus war would actually make an impact to the inputs and climate inputs. So that was an interesting one. Advancing environmental justice and kind of recognizing that those issues of justice, racial justice, are intertwined with climate change.
Hmm.
There's a whole chapter about water, Robert. You'll be happy to know.
Oh, okay.
And her number one recommendation there is to just learn more about water, learn more about where your water comes from and what impacts it. And, just be thoughtful about what you're putting into the waterways, either what you're putting on your yards or what you're pouring down the drain. So, back to your piece about cattle, maybe focus on eating more fruits and veggies and whole grains, reduce your food waste. She mentions migration, and I think for those of y'all listening to the news this month, the Haitian refugees coming to the United States, a lot of folks are considering those migrants as climate migrants, people fleeing conditions that are no longer supportive of a quality of life because of changes in the climate. So, just recognizing that migration is an outcome of climate change and finding compassion for those people that are being displaced. She talks about what we can do to support a transition in the workplace as far as moving from jobs that are more focused on fossil fuels to those more focused on renewables. This one was interesting, and there's only a few more. She says, try to be healthy and take good care of yourself because the environment's going to throw you some curveballs. I thought this was interesting. And when I was doing my reading this month, I saw an article about in Texas the coming of valley fever, which is a fungal soil-borne disease that is traditionally only been found in Arizona and California, but it's moving our direction because of the arid soils.
Hmm.
And so, just that as the climate changes, we're going to encounter a lot more unusual disease. And so, the more you can protect your own health, the more resilient you'll be personally. And then just, trying to reduce your use of single use plastics and paper products. And finally, thinking about where your money goes and making sure that, your financial inputs are not contributing to things that cause harm to the climate. So there you go. That's Jane Fonda. That's what
All
she
right.
says you can do to make a difference.
That's very good. So I guess my bit of good news is comes from The Economist, and The Economist writes quite a bit about climate. That they see it as appropriately so as a major challenge for the world for many of the reasons that you just mentioned out of Jane Fonda's book. I have friends from across the political spectrum, and one thing I hear from some of them is that they'll concede that human forced climate change exists, it's causing problems, but they're not interested in doing anything about it, or don't think the United States should do anything about it until China does something about it. And The Economist is either, I think it was issue from 3 weeks ago, um, talked about, China certainly does have a major role in um, carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions, and it, not only in China but across the world, because they're funding a lot of projects across, particularly the developing world. That about 70% of all coal plants being built today rely to some degree on financing from China. Um, but China's president Xi Jinping told the United Nations on September 21st that China would stop supporting new coal power projects overseas.
Nice.
And then, if you've been watching the news lately, there was some interesting articles about parts of China running out of power, and and it was in those words, running out of power. I'm like, how do you run out of power? But China does have emission requirements on its different states, and that quote unquote running out of power was related to them having too many emissions and just shutting down power plants to meet what their goals were.
Wow.
That's pretty dang serious about
Yeah.
addressing global, greenhouse gas emissions. So China does appear to be taking things more seriously. Is there more they could do? Yes, there certainly is, and that you could say that about any country on the planet. But it does appear that they are taking this far more seriously. And if you look at their hydrology, they're they're a majorly dry country. A sizable part of that country is pretty dry, and if they're looking at the climate projections, they're probably a little concerned. So certainly they have ample reason to try and take this more seriously. So I thought that was all good news.
Good one. Good one. Yeah. Take that, U.S. Get to it. Get on it.
I don't know about you, Carrie, but I feel like a poem.
I knew you would. So I got you one. So we'll close today with I'm going to read a poem because copyright won't let us play it for you. But for those of you that listen to NPR, you might have heard of the Typewriter Rodeo. And I've actually run into them at events across town here in Austin. But it's a group of poets who have vintage typewriters, and they will write you a poem about any topic. And you just give them a word to write about or a keyword. So this one is called Climate Change, and it's written by Sean Petrie. And here we go. I get it. It's overwhelming. Floods, then drought, then fires, then all the above. Plus crippling ice storms. Remember those? And I'd like to pretend, too, that it's not happening. It's cold out today. What global warming? Haha. The same way the world looks flat, just from my front yard. But the bigger picture is more difficult, yes? But also harder and harder to ignore. I get it. I'd like to pretend, too, that it will all just go away. But I'm not sure pretending from my front yard is any longer an option. So perhaps, like a neighbor after a flood, we can start helping each other out a bit more before. Yay! Snaps.
Hear my snapping. Yes, pretty good. So I think I have run into those folks before. So when you bump into them, is it just like somebody with an old typewriter on the sidewalk? So I have, yeah.
And you could just say cats, and they'll write you a poem right there about cats.
And I've got somewhere in my office. I've got my home office. I've got a poem hanging up. And it's from a while ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Bumped into him on Congress. It was like, tipped $1 and got a poem or something.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. I thought that was great. Well, thanks, Robert. It's been fun.
Yes. That was our first guest, so that seemed to go pretty well.
Yeah.
I'm
glad you got to have your favorite
yes,
guest
my
on
favorite.
First.
Yes. So I guess next up we need your girl crush,
Jane Fonda. I'm going to put a call out.
Okay.
Yeah.
You should. Who knows? So tune in next time when you'll hear some more news about climate change with a little bit of a Texas bent. And we'll have another guest with us. We don't have the guest lined up yet, but I know it's going to be a good one.
I do too. Thanks, y'all. Take care.
All right. Stay cool, everybody.
Good lady.